my inner knowing, empowering you to find your compass for the journey. We are dedicated to supporting you to rediscover and trust your natural ability to navigate life each day by sharing insight and experience through the lens of two professional communicators and their guests. We intend to prompt internal inquiry that supports all those willing to explore a unique path. Well, hello.
Well, hello. How are you?
I am great.
Good.
Happy to be with you.
Oh, thanks, babe. I'm happy to be here too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this topic is going to be a hard one to explore.
Yeah.
And so we're just going to share our perspectives and thoughts and experiences around domestic violence. And, when I brought up the topic the first time, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm already avoidant.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember what you thought or felt?
Anxiety. I can feel it right here. That spot.
Yeah.
My dark spot.
Yeah.
Right by the heart. Mm-hmm.
What do you think? I mean, I have thoughts about that. What do you think that reaction in your body is connected to?
Just instances, several of domestic violence that I experienced as a child.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anything that you want to share?
There's several.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. Sure. One working that I worked through in a psychodrama.
Mm-hmm.
So it was substantial, but I've processed it. Still, I don't go there very often, but so my parents got divorced when I was 3, and then there was a series of stepfathers while I lived with my mother until I moved to live with my dad when I was 10.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first stepfather was a Navy veteran, and he had 3 children from his first marriage. A couple of the boys, his 2 boys, lived with us, and we liked each other a lot.
Oh.
We played together, and my recollection, don't think I've ever asked my sisters, but
Sure.
my second oldest sister and I were there, and I think my oldest sister moved out because she didn't like it, and then my next 2 older sisters were with me with those children and him.
Mm-hmm.
So let me get to it.
That's okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. No,
there's an avoidance piece in laying that all out, but it's to be expected. I'm sure you see it. So the memory that comes to mind, I mean, he did things like spanking us with a belt, and he would, when you got in trouble, you'd get sent upstairs. And it was usually more than one of us that, we'd be, I don't know. I remember with one of his boys, we were out playing in the creek and we walked intentionally across a board that had nails in it. So we both poked our feet.
Oh, gotcha.
Just kind of as a daring thing, getting the nail to go through your shoe. I mean,
ouch.
Anyway, of course, they're like tetanus. And so
Right.
they got to pay for tetanus shots and money was tight. And I mean, I remember I would go just see what he was doing as little kids do. And he was always at this, a desk with one of those old fashioned 70s, curved desk lamps that people had. You clicked a button and it was a fluorescent light. So the room was dark, and there he is. And he was always seemed stressed about paying bills.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, but we got in trouble because it was going to be an expense. I got sent upstairs. And this happened frequently. I mean, I don't know. It wasn't daily. but he would take his belt off and start downstairs, and he would fold it in half so you could bow it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he'd snap that as he walked across underneath us,
Mhm.
and then all the way up the stairs coming to the room where we were.
Yeah.
And so, there was a hard side to him. He grew up hard out in the country, old school beatings of people. But anyway, that's just a precursor. So my mom and he separated at some point, and but the boys were still living with us. And I woke up one night, and I'm probably 6, maybe 5. And it's very vivid to me. They're screaming downstairs. It's just he and my mom. And I can't remember his words, but I remember her screaming, "Get out of my house, get out of my house." And they were at a couple steps up from the bottom of the stairs because all the bedrooms were upstairs. So it was a couple steps up to a landing, and then more steps up to where the bedrooms were. And, I was in bunk beds with the 2 boys, and the girls were in other rooms. But, so I wake up to that screaming, and it's getting, to the point where he's slamming her into the wall. You can hear just boom, boom, boom. And she's screaming.
Yeah.
And he's screaming. I don't remember. And, I tried to wake the other kids up, and I'm assuming they were pretending to be asleep. They just weren't going to. So nobody responded to me. And so I crept down the hallway. But I was too afraid to, actually peek around the corner. And that's all I remember of it. I know he left.
Yeah.
And then I don't think it was immediately after that, but ultimately his kids went with their mom, and we ended up moving we went up to my dad's house for Christmas vacation is what happened. And he came by the house. Mom was in a Bible study. Yeah, she did some she got into fundamental, it wasn't fundamental, but it was heavy, I don't know, Christian stuff. And so she was doing Bible study, and he came by the house, and he had her come outside. Oh, I do remember what he was saying when he was slamming her against the wall. "I'm going to kill all of you." I blocked that out.
Yeah. Yeah.
"I'm going to kill all of you." Yeah, it was terrifying. And the fact that nobody else would even acknowledge they were awake was terrifying.
Alone.
Yeah.
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 So anyway, he came by, and we weren't there, but Mom was. She came outside, and he was threatening to kill her, and then he blew his head off.
Wow.
In the front yard. So she came up, and and I loved him.
Yeah.
Regardless of all the rest. And so, but I remember being there when she shared it with us, and she didn't give the details. I got the details years later in a police report
Wow.
that came to light because of some other things. But in any event, I had read the whole police report. And so it's fascinating how this is 1975, 76, something like that, how the police were blaming my mother in the report.
Wow.
This was the woman's fault.
Wow.
And it's fascinating stuff.
Wow.
Just shocking.
Yeah.
So anyway, and that's the end of this one, except my dad was sitting down. We were down in the basement. Everyone's around. My dad's sitting there, they're divorced, but he's there, and she's telling us, and I wanted to cry so bad, but I didn't cry because I didn't want to hurt my dad's feelings by being sad that my stepfather had killed himself.
Wow.
Yeah. And I remember going to school and kids were talking about it,
Yeah.
So one of many instances.
Yeah. How do you feel like that influenced who you were as a husband?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a husband?
Yeah.
Passive.
Mm.
I mean, it isn't like I wouldn't, I'm no saint.
Yeah.
I didn't break things when I was married, but, or punch holes in walls, that happens too. And it wouldn't be surprising given the examples I was given as a kid. But, unless I was driven into a corner, passive, and which was a huge, it just devolved the relationship, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think if I hadn't been, from the beginning, that maybe it would have worked out, that we would have established boundaries and she wouldn't have, devolved the way she did, because we got together when we were 16 or 14. Yeah. And, she was sweet in so many ways.
Yeah.
But it just, that passivity, and I'll do, whatever you want, I want you to be happy, just complete, giving away of self. Not that I didn't have selfish moments. I'm not, like I said, I'm not pretending. Right. And I don't know why I have to explain it, but I do, apparently.
That's okay.
So, but there were other parts, because my dad had a horrible temper, would break things. He threw a phone through the window once. Because he was a doctor, and they incessantly contacted him by pager and by phone, et cetera. And he just freaked out one night and threw the phone through his bedroom window.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was a double paned window. And so I can remember him throwing, like, once we were outside and he got in an argument with my stepmother at the time, stepmother one. And he had this, one of those 4-pronged, tilling rakes or whatever.
Oh, sure.
He threw that rake up so high. It was just like, whoa, it was scary.
Yeah.
So there were times when I got pushed and pushed and pushed where I would just, scream, both of us. And maybe slam doors. And I remember she had like this runner, just one of those cotton runners, all lacy and stuff. This when we were relatively first married, and I don't even know what it was about, but I remember standing there, and I was totally a child, and I grabbed that runner and I just wadded it all up to, because she had it like perfectly starched, wadded it all up and threw it down, to hurt her.
Yeah.
And she burst into tears.
Yeah.
So 2 little children standing there doing their thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, it affected me in those ways.
Yeah.
But most of the time it was more just going along to get along. And avoidant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. As you know, I'm avoidant still.
Yeah. Working on it.
I'm so complex.
Yeah, we all are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could stand up for people in my role as a lawyer, fight for them. But, being able to acknowledge where I am, et cetera, is a lot harder. So anyway.
Yeah. What else are you thinking?
Just all the other stuff that went on too. It's crazy pants stuff.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's my experience, one of them. A couple, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, what I remember earliest, between my parents, I mean, I had to have been 3, and so it's really amazing to think about that, that I would have been that young and remember. Yeah, so clearly. We were in the house that we lived in off Holmes, and I remember my mom had this pink nightgown, and it was like, like mid-thigh, and, I don't remember what my dad was wearing. I just remember like being in the living room, and we had, bookshelves. I don't remember where they were. And I just remember I have this vision of my mom throwing books at my dad, across the living room. Um, and I don't remember any other details about it other than it was really scary.
Yeah.
Um, and my dad was someone who would throw things for sure. I don't remember him, you know, doing much cussing, but definitely throwing things, breaking things when he got really upset. Um, and then, you know, my dad was a belt person too. The reality is I don't remember being spanked by the belt, but I remember the snapping thing you talked
Really?
about.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Terror.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's the sounds of things, that stick with you. But I remember as a child too snapping the belt, like there was, I don't even know, some power in snapping the belt,
Sure.
Um, and then when I was, I think 10, I remember the only time I remember being, hit by one of my parents. I was so mad at my parents for not letting me go spend the night at a friend's house who I spent the night at all the time. um, but there was only one other child living in her house as opposed to the 6 other children living in my house. So I liked going over there. It was, peaceful and quiet. No one was arguing with me or anything. And I remember that my parents, for whatever reason, that one night, told me I couldn't go. And ooh, I just was so upset. And my dad sent me away from the table, the dinner table, and I was in the living room and I was just getting so much more desperate and so much more angry. And I remember I remember yelling out that they were like a witch and a werewolf. And my dad, oh, he lost his mind about that. Yeah. And, you know, came into the living room and, physically like picked me up and threw me up the stairs and then chased me up the stairs and then picked me up and threw me against the wall, underneath my bed, like the bunk bed. And I know he hit me too. Um, and I know it because I can visualize it. I can't visualize the pain. What I really remember more than anything was I don't think I had ever seen my dad so out of control. I mean, the breaking things was, I don't know, it was more common. And so it didn't like impact me the same way, but that was different. I don't have recollections of my parents hitting my siblings either, but I'm guessing that there was some belt stuff and hitting stuff. I mean, I was the 5th, right, of 8
Right.
kids. And so I'm sure things changed over time.
Sure.
But for me, that was the most significant, incident. And then I was violent as a child, no doubt, defending, myself against my siblings. And that was aggressive. And so I was aggressive. And then when I was 13, I didn't want to be that anymore. And then when I got married, there was this kind of weird mixture, but I really think I stepped away from the aggression mostly. And I think I became passive aggressive in words. I do remember, when I was married the first time that, like, I remember he got really mad about something and like threw like his keys. And I remember them hitting the wall. And I remember, being really upset and like pounding him on the chest, but I don't remember anything about like what the situation was, just that recognition that I felt completely out of control. And then when we were going through our divorce, I remember that I came to pick up the kids one day and he told me that he wasn't going to let me divorce him. And I lost my mind and um, just freaked out because I didn't know, if it was true or not true.
Right.
I just knew I couldn't do it anymore. But I also know that, Chris, my oldest, was probably 6 at the time. He remembers that. He remembers me screaming and yelling and just, the only time I think that he felt afraid, when he was young.
Of you or general?
Maybe general. It would
Wow.
be an interesting question to ask him. I don't know the answer to that. I just know that he and I've talked about it. Yeah. And then, in my second marriage, I remember, that he got really upset. I don't remember all the details. I remember that he felt out of control, and I remember I was frustrated, I was angry, but there was also like a, I don't really care what you think or feel,
Dismissiveness.
Yeah, there was definitely that piece in there too. So even though I was hurting about whatever, often, just feeling not important or not chosen, and so justified, about whatever, he was angry about. And I remember that I was holding, one of the kids, and he came and like took the child out of my arms and then gave the child to the oldest. And then essentially like football tackled me, and, I was thrown up against the refrigerator. And I hadn't ever experienced that before.
Yeah.
But weirdly enough, even though I was a fighter, I knew not to fight, then, like I remember just laying on the ground and, he was yelling. I don't remember what. I just remember thinking, just don't move. Just don't move. And so I didn't. And then later finding out, I didn't know it right away, but that the refrigerator had like literally gone through the drywall, behind it. I mean, I knew the refrigerator was dented, but I didn't know, it just wasn't something I knew for probably a year or two. I think I was having the kitchen painted and was like, oh, and then it kind of like came back,
Sure.
To me. And so, for me, that's what comes to mind, when I think, about what I've experienced, whether it was as a child, or as a partner, to someone.
How do you think that's impacted you in relationship?
Well, I would say I don't recall ever being a thrower of things. So I'm guessing that I chose the opposite, in that regard. I know I chose the same, like my mom was passive aggressive. And so I know that I took that on. I didn't realize that until much later. I didn't realize that until my second marriage, how passive aggressive I was. When I was struggling, I didn't know how to have a good, clear, compassionate voice. I mean, that was not developed. So I know I was passive aggressive for sure. And then I would say, yeah, not allowing my children to touch each other, or make fun of each other. tease each other, tickle each other. None of that was allowed. So for me, that no doubt came from those experiences with what I witnessed and experienced with my siblings mostly. And then the bigger instances of, the sexual abuse, that I experienced. And then I would say, in my first marriage, he got so much of the responsibility in the struggle because he was so passive. And I was more, frustrated, wanting relationship, but not knowing how to do it in any healthy way. But when I got married again and I felt similar feelings, and they were such different men, like how they walked in the world, I was surprised that I had similar feelings. And that really caught my attention. And I was like, okay, this is something in me that is struggling. And then starting therapy and, recognizing, that his coping when he was struggling was to try to get like physically big, more like intimidating, which then just brought out my, like fighter piece. And even though we didn't like fight, it still was the energy.
Sure.
And that's actually when I did EMDR the first time. So 2 years ago, 21, 22 years ago, maybe longer. Because I didn't want that feeling anymore. I didn't want to feel that out of control. I didn't want to feel that afraid. I really wanted to, regardless of what was presented to me, someone's aggression, I didn't want to have those experiences anymore. And that was actually really helpful for me. I remember the next time it happened, and he was stepping into that energy that I just was like, oh, look, I'm not having that. I'm not feeling that in my body. I can just sit here and observe what's happening and trying to figure out what is happening.
Not matching the energy.
Not matching the energy.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And just trying to make it make sense. I mean, that was really where I went to. Just trying to understand, like, how did we get here? How did this happen?
Yeah. Sometimes it just doesn't make any sense because it's not rational.
Right.
Like the last argument we were talking about the other day between us.
Right.
It wasn't rational. Not on my part, anyway.
Well, like you said, we were tired and traveling, and it's not an excuse. It's just trying to hold context, right, for the reality of the complexity of our humanness, right? It's not about not setting boundaries. It's
right.
It's really like, can we see more clearly what's happening? Can we be like honest with ourselves, with what's happening, whether it's us or the other person or both, because sometimes it is the other person, I mean, not that we're not in relationship, we're in relationship, but sometimes people, just regardless of what we do, try to control us. And there's that aspect too. I haven't had that in my relationships, neither one of my marriages. I didn't experience that from my parents, still don't experience that from my parents. I feel like they're pretty, I'm not saying they agree or like everything that we choose, but I don't experience my parents as trying to control our choices. Right. And I mean, I did have that one uncle who really, continued every time I saw him to try to, impact me negatively.
Yeah.
By being insulting. I mean, he's no longer alive, so I don't have that experience anymore. But I didn't have, I don't know that I've ever, for any extended period of time, had someone in my life who really needed to dominate me all the time. Yeah. What are you thinking?
Just a couple of things. One, I'm rolling through instances in my mind now. So I need to get myself present.
Yeah.
and the other is, because I'm living in the past as I'm doing it, so everybody understands that's part of what we are all about, which is getting, if you're in touch with the body lives here in the present.
Yeah.
And so I need to do a little bit of that while I'm talking now.
What do you need to do?
I just felt my feet against the floor and felt my breath in my chest, the rise and fall.
Mm-hmm.
You could feel the breath in lots of areas, but those are two really quick ways to, hey, here I am, instead of dissociative.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because we can talk and engage and look like we're present and not be, right? A different part of our brain is like taking over.
Yeah, and another is, you see, I'm closing my eyes and I'm not being dramatic. I was doing it for me. Is a way to remove other stimuli, and center in your thoughts and to be coherent, to be present.
Yeah.
So a few tips for people. Sorry.
Yeah. What are you apologizing for?
Oh, just because I want to be present for you, but hearing your trauma, and I've heard some of it. And we end up, you hear a little bit more and, pieces come out because we describe it in different ways. More comes out over time.
Yeah.
And then thinking about the arguments we have had and thinking, I don't want to be that way. And I don't want to acknowledge, my part in that sort of, behavior. And then wondering, well, what is the definition of domestic violence? Because one thing I do know is I can become a screamer and use harming, foul language, to gain power and to shame or to strike out somehow, trying to hurt. And that was rampant in my marriage.
Yeah.
I want to say it hasn't happened very often between us, but it has happened. I mean, it's just a fact. And so when you say, how is the death threat and suicide from that stepfather, he wasn't a cusser, he was a religious guy and he didn't cuss, but my dad was a screamer and cursed and taught.
Yeah.
And so is that domestic violence? Using that sort of, big behavior with the demeaning curse words, is that domestic violence? If it's not, it certainly can lead to it.
Yeah.
When you start down that path, I mean, that, thank God I never have done that. Struck anybody. For me, it was really about trying to, protect and hurt, but to get away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's part of my avoidance piece. I can get big and stuff, but what I really ultimately is I want to go hide somewhere, make it stop.
Right.
So anyway, I'm interested in how in the therapist chair you would define domestic violence, but I think it's really important that even if it doesn't, everybody can have their spectrum of what that means, right?
Sure.
And if people my age, your age, I'm older than you, but, it was it was a different world. And I think there's multiple people that I know who are my age or older whose parents would smack the shit out of them,
right?
Whether it was a belt or a cuff across the face,
right?
And so I think we can adopt this viewpoint that, well, that was good for me, made me tough.
Oh, I've heard
and I
those.
Deserved it. I've heard,
Yeah.
So anyway, but there were multiple times it was like the rule: don't put your elbow on the table. With my mother, she would smack your ass off your chair.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, hitting your head, your arms to get them off the table if they came back up after she said, don't do that.
Yeah.
That's domestic violence to me.
Yeah.
And I remember at least one night where it happened more than once because I just wasn't, just a kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, there's all that going through. It's probably why I started to like drifting away internally, because it's
Yeah.
hard to face my experience and then load your experience on top,
Right.
and then even on top of that is, when have I done things that are, going down that road? When have I behaved in an abusive manner? And, none of us want to be that or to acknowledge it, especially.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oof, there's so many things I think about. I would say in, relationship with you, I think pretty early on, I recognized when you got upset that you weren't actually talking to me.
Yeah.
Even if you were upset with me, like I was like I knew that the level of reaction you were having wasn't congruent with what we were going through.
Yeah.
And so I was able to separate that out. It didn't mean I liked it, right? And it still was hurtful, but I didn't,
Right.
I wasn't shutting down. It's terrible, but part of me was more curious. It's not terrible, but I was just like fascinating, and not to diminish your pain, because you were experiencing pain in our relationship. And that was what you knew how to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, that first time I was just like, that's so interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you,
Yeah. That time wasn't about you.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, but not really. Maybe 1%.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
yeah.
it doesn't. Even thinking, because there's my marriage, was. It's disappointing. If I could go back and change,
Yeah.
I would.
Oh,
I
yeah.
regret.
Oh, sure.
Even though it was, ugly and I was mistreated too, I regret treating somebody that way, reacting that way.
Right. Right.
In any event.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you.
Soul apologies,
Yeah. Yeah.
for having been like that. And, I'm happy to say that with you, it's, it's only happened rarely, I think, unless I'm lying to myself, you can correct me.
No.
Yeah. But I also know this, you've gotten big with me a few times too, to the point where I'm like, you need to back off. And I don't know the rest of my reaction, probably that I, scream or whatever. I don't know, but that it's just like, we don't do that.
Yeah.
I don't do that, because if you can't stop at that point, then other things could happen if you lose your shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I feel good in our relationship that when that has happened, it's just like, we don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Versus I get, physically big and, throw my chest at you or whatever. Because those things can happen. And, from life or the news or family things that it can, escalate to people beating each other up, or
absolutely.
the man beating the hell out of the woman, or vice versa. It just depends on circumstances, because it can happen both ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
But God, it's complex,
It is. And I think about, I can, for me, that was like I think it's like a physical piece where, my shoulders probably get wider and my voice probably gets stern, is what I would guess. And I laugh because that is what you say, like, oh, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
and like,
it is.
And that is.
I have to stop it.
Right. Right.
The physical aspect of it.
Right. Right. And then for me, when you say that, it is like, okay, what is going on for me? Why do I feel in threat right now?
Yeah.
Right.
Where do you think you learned to get big like that? Is that from your dad?
Maybe my dad. It's funny because I don't know that it was my dad.
It
I'm
could
not.
just be nature, I mean,
It could
that's part
be
of us, a fear
the
reaction.
protective,
Yeah.
piece. Yeah, yeah. You're not going to harm me that way.
Right.
Yeah, could be. No, I don't really experience my dad that way. I mean, again, throwing things and then that one experience of him, I just think he felt out of control. And not, excusing his behavior. None of it was okay. But that just wasn't it wasn't his way of walking around the house when he was upset, was to
all the
like
time.
get big,
Yeah.
right? I mean, he was big.
Yeah.
I mean, 6'3", 6'4", he's tall, right?
Wiry.
But I don't have a recollection of him like throwing his shoulders back and like getting big.
on.
Yeah, no.
Up on you, yeah.
No. That would probably have been, extended family that I could visualize that kind of body language of getting big with, but not my dad or my mom. Yeah. You asked me to, just as a mental health professional, and I think the answer to that, it's so complex, I mean, there's plenty of books that have been written, out there about different, types of people who are people that engage in domestic violence. And I would say that, there are people who I think do it regularly as a part of being in a way of being in relationship. And then I think there is situational domestic violence, where people who are not typically engaging with each other that way lose it. Right. And again, no, it's not okay regardless, but they are not the same at all. Clients that I've worked with who were, regardless of their choices and whether they were aggressive or passive aggressive, were tormented by their partners, male or female. And I had a childhood friend that was murdered by her partner.
Yeah.
Those are different situations for sure, and not what I know. I have not experienced that relationally, that the intensity, I've never been made to sleep outside on the front porch in a dog bed. I've never been locked out of my own house. I've never been thrown down the stairs. I never had, my neck broken by my partner.
Yeah.
Those have never been a part of my experience.
Yeah.
But I know that they have been part of the experiences of people that I have worked with. And that's, it's different. Again, I think about, what the word that continues to come back to me is this need to dominate, others. I need to control others' behavior for whatever reason, that is for that person, to inflict that level of pain, that level of control. But then also not having, I don't know if I think probably sometimes it's not any awareness on a person's part, like this is all they've known relationally. And so not taught to have any reflection, learning to externalize, what happens to you. I think I've talked about this, but, when the kids were young, I remember, like one of them running into the coffee table, and my then husband saying, bad table. And I was like, what? What? And he's like, well, I don't want him to think that it's his fault. And I'm like, but it is his fault. He ran into the table. It's not the table's fault. And I remember even then being really clear that I didn't want my kids to think that if they were, that they were harmed, that they should just assume that they were harmed because it was an external experience, right? I wanted them to learn from the experience. And so for me, not blaming others, as a reflective reaction was a good thing. I want us to increase our awareness and be thoughtful, what's happening for me? Why am I choosing this? What do I want most right now? I remember that I was in this doctor's office years ago, probably like 8 years ago. And he was so condescending and dismissive. And it was so bad. And I just remember him leaving the room. And I mean, just wanted to take him out, and it was definitely verbal, there was that part of me that was, thinking of all the things that I could do to shame him, because he was so shaming, to me. And I remember asking the nurse to come back in, and I just said, I want to have another conversation with him. Because I literally don't even know what just happened. And I sat there, and I was glad that I had the time because I kept asking myself, what do you really want? 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 What's really happening for you? And I had an hour because that doctor did not want to come back in the room, even though I hadn't done anything to shame him. He did not.
You sat in an exam room for an hour.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, waiting to say.
Yeah.
You have your say.
Yeah. And then, I finally opened the door again, and they were like, oh, you're still here. And I'm like, yes, I'm still here. I'm sitting in one of your main exam rooms, but okay. And he comes in, and he was, just as dismissive, like, what's up?
Attitude.
Right. I mean, it was just like, he knew that I had been in there for an hour. They all knew I had been in there for an hour. And they were all avoidant. And when he came in, I was in a different place. I had taken that time to really, again, ask myself, what's happening for you? What do you really want? And I could recognize, the shame and the dismissal and the making fun, of me about, the information that I was providing, because I'm trying to make sense about what was happening to me physically. And, and I just said, what you did wasn't helpful for me in any way. I'm not an orthopedic surgeon. I don't know what you need to know. I'm just trying to give you what I think might be helpful for you to understand what's happening for me. And the reality is when I leave here, I'm going to go home and my husband's going to ask me, how'd your appointment go? And I'm going to be like, I don't even know. I don't know what happened. And so I want more from you about what your thought process is, because I don't understand what's happening, And then he said, the reality is, I don't know what's happening. And I said, then just please tell me that.
Was that a dismissive statement, or was it an acknowledgement?
I think it was an acknowledgement.
So he heard you.
No, he did. Right. No, I really felt like he did. And I said, then just tell me that. I'm trying to be helpful. I'm trying to find an answer. Just be helpful to me.
Yeah, I think there's that fear piece of whatever his perfection was, or, it's like, I have to have an answer, and he wasn't finding it, so he bullied you.
He bullied me, right. Kept giving me
Bullshit.
things that it was like that. No. And then he was dismissive again. He went back to dismissive and deflective. And, but by then, I had what I wanted, which was really an answer, which was, I don't know. And so I was then able to leave and be like, okay, well, he didn't know. Well, I can go find somebody else and get another opinion. And I did. And he was like, oh, yeah, that makes complete sense. Did the surgery, have never had a problem since.
The new doctor.
The new doctor. Yeah, the new doctor.
Yeah.
But having that time, to be reflective for me when I, feel that, part, come up, the protective, defensive, shame triggered, dismissed, part is helpful for me. And then practicing again, asking myself all those questions, because I know the reaction is mine. I know it comes from my fear. I know it comes from my trauma. And so for me, getting clear, what do I really want right now has been really helpful for me in those situations. And again, it doesn't mean it always comes quickly, but it's like we were talking about in, the last episode, more practiced, I'm always experimenting, trying to figure out, what to say, how to say it differently, and not from a codependent way, right? Like I'm trying to make it go away. I'm really trying to figure out what's really happening for me.
Yeah. It's so hard.
Yeah.
I mean, it is at first anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You were blessed in a way to have that hour in the exam room. A lot of people would have just gotten angrier and more closed.
Right.
I think because you've been doing your work, was this after you'd been doing your work?
Yeah.
Okay.
This was probably 8 years ago.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I mean, you'd been down the therapy path for a long time. And so you were able to have some of that conscious awareness, and you also were gifted the time to do it in a kind of a backdoor way, right? So what advice can you give people? I want to see if there's some tools that you give people, not just in that situation. I know you're giving some right there, but, let's say that you hadn't had the hour, if you're in that situation now, how, I'm thinking of Gottman method type things for relationship issues, right?
Yeah. Go ahead. Keep going.
Well, we did some Gottman work for a while, and one of them is you just call time out. You have an agreement with the partner.
Right.
When I call time out, we both just disengage and go wait 10 minutes in silence somewhere else.
Right.
And then come back into the shared space. If we're still warmed up, hot to go, we need another break.
Right. And no threat of abandonment, right? Like we need space.
The lead into all that is really critical, that it's this is how we're going to operate in relationship when we're losing our shit.
Right.
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 Okay. And it is not going to work every time.
No. No, it's not. And
because the other person, no, and they won't let you go, or well, I want to talk about it now, and that sort of thing. And so we can resolve to do it, and then it doesn't always happen. But I think it's again inclining ourselves towards that as a way to diffuse situations. But if you're not with your partner, what would be your advice to people to be able to create some space so they could do that introspection that you're talking about, asking yourself those questions? What do I really want? What's motivating this feeling?
It's an interesting question because like everything else, it's so complex, right? It depends on the situation and the people involved and where are you? And, I'm thinking, sometimes it's, I don't know, like road rage type thing, just move on, right? Like this person is not in your life, even if, the choice that they made directly or indirectly, right? Because a lot of times we are just walking through the world really pretty unaware of others.
Yeah.
I would say just, again, what was that about for me? I think, if you're in a situation where you're, in a more, connected, experience of maybe like at a store or a parking lot or something, I think it would be like, is this truly important? I think like sometimes there's road rage and people follow people to a gas station or they'll follow people, right?
Crazy stuff. Yeah.
Right. And then it's like, do I really need to get out of my car?
Yeah.
Do I really need to go into Walmart right now?
Sure.
Am I ready for a fight right now? Am I pissed off about this, but I'm going to take it out on this situation?
Right.
So for me, even just that simple question, what's really happening for me right now?
Sure.
But learning to be honest with ourselves, right? That's the true, right? Because it can be like, well, they cut me off. And it's like, okay, what do you really want right now?
Right.
To be pissed, to let them know they're full of shit or they're, irresponsible or whatever, thinking that if you do that, that's going to change their behavior. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of things we can think, but if we can be honest practice being honest with ourselves, what is this really about? I think in those situations, we're more likely, again, inclining the mind, to be more honest with ourselves about what's happening. Because our personal relationships, whether it's our partner, our siblings, our parents, our kids, coworkers, I mean, we have lots of opportunity to practice what's really happening for me, right? And so I think if we can use those opportunities to be asking ourselves that, when those other situations come up, I think it's easier for us to get clear. I mean, I don't think I need an hour anymore to get clear.
Sure.
I mean, I did 8 years ago for sure, but I don't think I need an hour anymore. I think once the shift happens, again, whatever you were saying earlier, what is it that you said? If I get upset, this isn't happening, or
we don't do that.
Oh, we don't do that. Right. We don't do that. Yeah. When you say we don't do that, right? Like that's a shift for me.
Yeah.
And then I can it doesn't mean I'm ready,
right.
but I don't need an hour.
Right.
Right. Breathing.
Breathe. Yeah, absolutely.
Slow, deep breaths. Yeah. I also do imagine roots growing out the bottom of my feet, into the ground, and just imagine myself really grounded and held by the earth. That is something that I do when I am needing to get grounded. But again, the self-inquiry piece. What is really happening for me? What is it that I really need right now? What am I afraid of right now? I think are very helpful for me.
Yeah. How about advice for, if you're when you bring you back to full-on domestic violence, right? Advice for diffusing situations before they escalate. And then I'm going to ask you advice for it's escalating. What do you do?
Oh, babe.
Is that an answer for a law enforcement officer?
Well, I think it's really complex. I think it's so situational. I mean,
lots of variables with the other person's history,
truly
mindset,
right,
all that.
Right. Safety, what's past threats. I really think the best thing you can do is to find, professionals who are skilled in this area, right? Who really are curious with you about your situation. They're not making assumptions, they're using their experience to really help you get clear, as best you can what's happening for you, boundaries you need to set, if there's safety things you need to take into consideration, safety plans. I think there's just so much. And so what I think about really is more than trying to figure that out on a podcast episode is can we push through the shame that we feel about the situation to ask for help and stick with the process no matter how hard it is. Learning to set boundaries, learning what our codependence is.
When you say codependence, what is it?
Thinking that we can negotiate ourselves out of relationships or situations that we can't, that we can't say the right thing. We can't do the right thing. That's just going to be the shift, right? Like we're not in relationship with someone who wants the same as we do or who wants healthy relationship, because not everybody wants healthy relationship, right? And so for me, again, finding people that are, curious, compassionate, and skilled, and really helping you get clear about what your situation is.
Sure.
I really think is the best thing that I could say right now.
Yeah. And in advance is just doing, starting to do your work.
Absolutely.
Look at yourself and, go to therapy or, start meditation or whatever it is. Just, self-compassion and when we move along that spectrum,
Yeah.
I think, we learn to be able to set boundaries
Mm-hmm.
earlier and know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in relationship.
Right.
If we are skirting that line or cross that line,
Right.
I'm protecting myself, I'm leaving, or, that cannot happen.
Right. Right. And to really mean it, right?
Sure.
Not just the threat piece,
Oh,
right?
no,
right.
no.
Right. Like true
For
boundaries.
yourself, and this is
right.
about you, not negotiating.
Right. Right.
So that
right.
who you are and what you need, and how what you will accept in relationship.
Right. Right.
All along the spectrum of behavior, not just violence.
Right.
Right. And that's work.
Right. Right.
Still doing it.
Yeah.
We all are.
Always. Yeah. Yeah. I think about, adult children of alcoholics work, that can really help us.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we didn't have parents that were alcoholics, they could have had parents that were alcoholics. And so we can transfer down behaviors generationally, even if our parents weren't alcoholics.
Sure.
Right. But the codependency, piece. And so, really, again, exploring. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've worked with over the years who were just like, I just didn't know. And I'm like, of course, right? As opposed to feeling shame about it. It's like, right.
Yeah.
We all need more, perspective, learning, but we need people who are curious with us and help us really think about, the whole context, not just the behavior of the other.
Yeah.
So that we really are growing so that we can change our relationships going forward, whether it's that relationship or the next relationship.
Yeah.
That they can be healthier.
Yeah.
So anyway, big topic.
Yeah.
But we had to start somewhere. Yeah. Yeah.
I've been drifting in and out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and my hope is at some point, if we have some guests that have experienced, that type of domestic violence that is so insidious in their relationship, that can teach us more about their experience so we can continue to learn.
And avoid there's a shame piece too.
Yeah. Fear.
Having allowed yourself, I think, to, somehow I made that happen. Just all those aspects that, that are not helpful.
Not helpful. Yeah.
But I think it's human nature to take that on somehow.
Oh,
it's
sure.
common.
Well, or we're taught that, right? In our family system or relationship, this is yours to carry. I would not do that if you had not done that.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I think that is a very common phrase, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. You're the only person that makes me act that way. Things like that. Yeah. Anyway. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
I love you.
I love you too.
Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to explore life with you. We encourage curiosity, self-growth, and we strive to be more compassionate every day.